Hope everybody had a good Memorial Day weekend. Coronavirus in popular culture and in the national dialogue is no longer primarily a medical event. Over the long weekend, that shift has been completed. And what coronavirus now is a culture war. And this is by necessity because Donald Trump has failed on coronavirus from the standpoint of medical, as he might say. And the only way that Donald Trump can plausibly purport to appear to be winning, maybe, is to turn this into a culture war. And he's being assisted in doing that by the reopen protesters, by the anti-vaxxers, by the many others who are actively contributing to the demise of the United States being a laughingstock globally. The pandemic is a disease, and it is a disease prevalent over a whole country or the world. That's what we have in coronavirus. We have a pandemic. It is a medical situation. The culture war is a cultural conflict. It is a conflict between groups, social groups typically, sometimes economic groups, over values. It is a struggle for the dominance over values and beliefs and practices. And notice that the primary discussions of coronavirus as a medical issue have been forced into irrelevance by this administration. It started roughly a month ago when I told you that Donald Trump is getting away from press briefings and instead doing these CEO propaganda events, these pseudo rallies at warehouses that distribute PPE. I think he did one last week or the week before in Pennsylvania, I think it was. And to look at this in a different way, to look at it as a culture war, explains a lot of the nonsense that we're seeing. Let me give you an example. Churches pushed into phase one in a number of different states as one of the first types of entities that will reopen. It's indefensible scientifically, but it's a cultural signal. It's a way to signal virtue in a sense. And that's why so many governors have included houses of worship in phase one. They've been under huge pressure to do it. And this is why Donald Trump is now making a huge deal out of churches. And I'm going to deal a little bit later with the legal aspect of Donald Trump saying he will force governors to deem churches essential. But that now is a culture war around coronavirus, churches and going to church. Masks. Masks are now part of the culture war. You wouldn't have thought of a mask as a political tool 6 months ago. It is strictly political now for a huge portion of American society. Medical issues have been relegated to irrelevance. Discussions of the R naught, the reproduction rate of the virus. They're talking about it in Germany. Angela Merkel is talking about it in Germany as they look to reopen. They talk about it in New Zealand. Contagion, treatments, and vaccines. These things are being mentioned by Trump only in the context of continuing to wage the culture war. And in fact, even treatment has become an opportunity to virtue signal. Do you blindly follow Trump on hydroxychloroquine or do you not, regardless of what the science says? This is by design. This is the only way that Donald Trump can sort of continue to justify his presidency, to justify his reelection, or to even have a shot at that reelection. And this is a movement that has turned a medical incident into a culture war. The movement, understand, is an amalgamation, as I wrote on Twitter yesterday, of Trump supporters who just follow Trump no matter what, so-called libertarians who are just focused on the so-called liberty elements, which I'll discuss a little bit later today, anti-vaxxers, and conspiracy theorists. This is a Venn diagram. Those groups overlap, but they have coalesced perfectly to pervert the handling of the pandemic, as a medical incident, and instead have turned it into a culture war. By the way, why was Donald Trump the one briefing Americans from day one anyway, or Mike Pence or whoever it was? Because of the culture war aspect of this. The way to depoliticize a pandemic is to do what many countries have done. You have doctors do the briefings. Look at how Ebola was handled back in 2014 in some of the outbreak countries in Africa. Public health officials were the ones communicating with the public, not incompetent partisans. But this is a strategy. It's a concerted effort, and the Trump administration realizes this is their only shot. So they are actively escalating the culture war component. Every time Trump issues a threat about overriding governors, those are not medical statements. Those are not constitutional statements. He actually can't do it legally, and I'll talk about that in a moment. These are merely claims from Trump to amp up the culture war. And this reminds me more and more over the cultural battle over a medical procedure known as abortion. And in fact, sometimes it's been mentioned. Trump has even mentioned there are governors saying abortion clinics are essential, but churches are not. That's red meat culture war language. Having Kayleigh McEnany regularly attack the press in briefings is another culture war component. Make this not about the medical facts, make it about fake news and perspective and point of view. Charlotte Klein gave this example in a really great piece in Vanity Fair. Here is Donald Trump's press secretary attempting to call out a reporter, Jeff Mason from Reuters, for asking whether it's really safe to go back to church, making it a personal thing where you as an individual don't like religion. Take a look at this.
The president will strongly encourage every governor to allow their churches to reopen. And boy, it's interesting to be in a room that desperately wants to seem to see these churches and houses of worship stay closed.
The president said that. Yes.
I object to that. I mean, I go to church. I'm dying to go back to church. The question that we're asking you and would like to have asked the president and Dr. Birx is it safe? And if it's not safe, is the president trying to encourage that, or does the president agree with Dr. Birx that people should wait?
Jeff, it is safe to reopen your churches if you do so in accordance with the guidelines, which are laid out.
So the reporter is asking about the safety of reopening from a medical perspective, and Kayleigh makes it about, wow, look at these leftist, loony, liberal, atheist reporters who are against religion. And the church component is particularly transparent with Donald Trump because Donald Trump has always been faking his supposed religiosity. He's never been religious. He never went to church. He was never against abortion. At 68 years old, he decided to run for president. Suddenly, the Bible's his favorite book. He had an awakening on abortion because he met a kid he liked where he learned the mom thought about getting abortion 20 years prior or however old the kid was. But when he was asked, oh, what passages of the Bible do you like? He said, that's personal. I'm not going to talk about that. The 2 Corinthians fiasco, autographing Bibles for people, not exactly showing deference to the sacred text. He was asked, are you an Old or a New Testament guy? He says both equally. He doesn't care to know anything about religion. Religion is merely the perfect tool to get people who would never otherwise have voted for Donald Trump voting for him despite his moral failings. And now it is a huge part of amplifying the culture war, religious versus non-religious, libertarian versus, everybody else. When religion would ideally have no place in a presidential election or in figuring out what to do about coronavirus. Okay, so they're fighting this as a culture war. What's the damage done by that? That's really the important question. The damage done by fighting this as a culture war is that it keeps people more divided than they actually need to be. The anti-vaxxer Bill Gates conspiracy people are emboldened by this culture war. They'd be mostly on the sidelines if it weren't for the amplification of the culture war. The more people that are angry and divided about something as empirically definable as a virus, like we know what the virus is. Okay, we don't know the exact reproduction rate. There are question marks, of course. How much contagion is really happening from surfaces? Okay, but this is an empirically knowable event, the coronavirus. They have figured out a way to get away from the empirical questions and get to these culture war type questions. And the reason that they don't want the serious conversations happening, hey, how do we reasonably balance the economy and public health? It's a great question. There's a range of opinions on the left and right. They don't want real conversations happening between left and right on those issues because they will inevitably be conversations that lead to the realization that Trump has failed from day one. Trump has to make this a culture war. We can hope for that the success he's having making this a culture war is premature, that ultimately, eventually, the facts on the ground will win out. But that depends on us. That doesn't depend on him. We know what the strategy is.